Good afternoon, everyone. This is Pierre Ferrari, CEO and President of Heifer International, and welcome to this session, which is titled "How a New Approach to Pricing Can Improve the Livelihoods in Coffee Farming Communities." So what we're trying to deal with is, despite the expertise and arduous work involved in growing high-quality coffee, farmers basically don't get value for their coffee. And because they don't get value for their coffee, they are mired in poverty. So how do we back up sustainability and ethical sourcing claim, which almost every coffee company makes, and ensure that coffee farmers at the end of the supply chain are receiving a fair price for their coffee? So we have three wonderful, extremely expert people in this area. And I would like to introduce Grayson Caldwell, Senior Manager of Sustainable at Bellwether Coffee, Monica Tavier, Director of Sales for Sustainable Harvest, and our own heifer, Corey Gilman, Strategic Initiative Manager for Coffee and Commodities at Heifer International. Maybe the best way to begin for a quick introduction. And Grayson, I would begin with you. Introduce yourself, what work you've done, and then I'll go on to Monica, and then we'll go on to Corey. So Grayson, you're on.
That sounds good. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Grayson Caldwell. I am the Senior Sustainability Manager at Bellwether Coffee. My background is in development. I served in the Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic and have been with Bellwether for over 2 years, leading our sustainability work from everything from supporting farmer equity to how we can decarbonize the coffee industry.
So where were you in Peace Corps?
The Dominican Republic.
Dominican Republic. Okay, so you speak Spanish as well, huh? Good.
I do.
Sí, yeah. Monica.
Hi there, I'm Monica Tavier with Sustainable Harvest based in Portland, Oregon. I've been with Sustainable Harvest for about 4 years as their Director of Sales. So leading our sales team to build strong relationships between coffee buyers and producers. My background is in coffee. I started as a barista in college and then fell in the quicksand trap, and I'm happy to be here. And I made the switch to green coffee when I really fell in love with the production side of things after spending 4 months volunteering for a cooperative in Guatemala.
Guatemala. Where in Guatemala?
Just outside of Antigua in Ciudad Vieja.
Oh, yeah, sure. Very nice place.
It was beautiful.
Yeah. Corey.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Corey Gilman. I'm the Strategic Initiatives Manager at Heifer, focusing largely on coffee and other tropical commodities. I've been at Heifer for about 3.5 years now, I believe. My background actually is originally in advertising. And very long story short, I ended up spending about a year in Southeast Asia on coffee farms and just completely fell in love with the producers, fell in love with the work, and was just blown away by how labor intensive, how intricate it was, learned a lot about agroforestry and conservation management, and ended up transitioning into the nonprofit sector from there.
Corey, I'm going to keep you on because verified living income needs to be defined, right? What is it exactly? And how will it move, or how potentially, and we can have that conversation with both Grayson and Monica, how will actually move the industry towards a pricing system and structure that could actually begin to end the incredible, miserable conditions most coffee farmers live in?
So in its most simple terms, verified living income is the price a producer, if we're going very, very micro, or a group of producers, a cooperative, if we're going more macro, needs to earn for their coffee in order to reach a living income. So instead of looking to the market to set baseline prices, we're looking at the realities and needs of farmers and hoping to set prices from there.
So once you go into the weeds a little bit about coffee, because we've got there's a market for coffee, a futures market, and then there's what actually the farmer gets at the farm gate. So explain that a little bit, because I think that's going to come up in the conversation we're going to have, and we need to have clarity about that.
Yeah, so farm gate prices is a term that is thrown around quite a bit, and then the other term a lot of folks in the coffee industry or other trade industries will probably hear a lot is free on board. So the farm gate price is very literally the price the farmers get. It stems from at the gate of the farm. So whether the producer is selling to a cooperative or another intermediary, that's how much he or she is paid for his or her coffee in whatever form that might be. It might be cherry in some regions. It might be a little more processed as parchment, but it's the amount of money that goes into a producer's pocket. The free on board price is what the market price refers to. And without going into a really boring amount of detail, it includes everything from transportation, processing, milling, warehousing, getting coffee on a ship. So that way it's ready to go into its final destination. And depending on the region and depending on the supply chain, the farm gate price is usually between, let's say, 60 and 75% of the free on board price. So if the market price is $1, if you hear someone say coffee futures is $1, a farmer might only be earning 65 cents on that dollar. So we can't. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Quickly, so I think it's just really important as we talk, we can't confuse the price for coffee with what the price the producer is actually getting and how that contributes to total income.
So one final question. Actually, I'll turn over to Monica. The idea of verifiable living income, at the end of the day, perhaps, I wonder what your thoughts are, is something that needs to be communicated to consumers, right? Because they should be prepared, perhaps, I don't know, to pay a little bit more for their cup of coffee to ensure the farmers get paid a verifiable living income. So what's your experience in the market? Literally, both other roasters and consumers, because there's fair trade, there's a whole bunch of certification out there that make believe that the farmers are getting paid reasonably well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to answer it simply. I think for me, what it comes down to is how important context is and communicating to that, whether it's to a consumer or to a roaster, so they understand what a number means. When you tell a consumer that we paid $2.24 per pound FOB for their coffee, that can be somewhat meaningless if they're paying $3.50 for a cup of drip coffee, or they're going to the grocery store and they're paying $20 for a 12-ounce bag. So they're saying, okay, $2, what does that mean? That sounds low compared to what I'm used to. So for me, that's why I really like anchoring the conversation around living income, because regardless of what the dollar amount of the coffee is, it's going to change given the context. If we're looking at Rwanda versus Colombia versus Peru, knowing that the producer who grew this coffee earned a living income and is able to sustain themselves through this business that is their coffee farm, I think that's what really changes the conversation and allows us to then have a platform for where we can explain the complicated mechanisms through which farmers actually get paid, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And actually, I'm going to turn to Grayson as well, because you're in touch with a lot of consumers through your business as well. So how is that conversation initiated and discussed so that people understand what we're trying to do with verifiable living income?
Yeah, great question. So one thing when I started at Bellwether, we had the same sustainability claims that every coffee company has. We were fairly ethically, sustainably sourcing the coffee that we were purchasing. And so we actually conducted the pilot of verified living income in Colombia and found that within our own supply chain in Colombia, we weren't paying the fair price. That was what really shifted the conversation between us and our customers to say, we thought we were following the industry's best standards to pay a fair price to producers. And it turns out until we had data to back up what that fair price really is, rooted in living incomes, there's no, despite messaging that other coffee companies might be using, it's hard, or it's really hard to know if that price was really a fair price. And so I think to be honest in inviting consumers into that conversation and really being transparent about the price that was paid, both to producers, what we pay to importers, and what we're charging our customers, is really key to all of this.
So let me turn back to Corey now. In terms of calculating what a living income or living income price is, what do we need to do? Because I think you said something interesting there, Grayson. You said, you've got to go back and calculate, right? You've got to understand, estimate, and be in touch with the communities to see what a living income actually means, right? Because otherwise you end up with a fair trade kind of approach that says, well, we think we can get the roasters to agree to $1.40 as a baseline price, but not based on any calculation that represents the requirement of the farmers, the farming families, right? So Corey, how do we actually calculate living income, verifiable living income? Or how do we get to verification, I guess, is really the point.
Right. So we start out with, I want to say, 5 main data categories or data points, which are both very simple and also very complicated. First, you have land size. So whether it's one producer you're looking at it or group of producers that are aggregated, you take the average land size that producer or group of producers is working on. You then look at how much coffee they're producing per hectare on that land. And ideally, which we did through the Verified Living Income project, is you're looking at sustainable production. You ideally want to take into account shade trees, a moderate tree density, lower agrochemical usage, et cetera. So you have the land size, you have the amount of coffee they're producing per hectare, and translate that into the total amount of coffee per farm. Then you have the living income benchmark, which is the goal. Pierre, as you know, that is a whole other complicated, extensive methodology, which essentially translates into the amount of money an average family in a specific region needs to live with dignity, take care of household needs, plan for the future, et cetera. And then you have the cost of production, which is very, very, very complicated. And one of the things we did with Verified Living Income that I know we all feel really strongly about is that we were very, very granular in the cost of production. We looked at these farms the way any business in the global north would look at their own expenses. It wasn't just the cash outlays, it was the absorbed cost of family labor. It was taking a look at how much are farm workers being paid compared to how much is the national minimum wage or the living wage in that area. It's, are they paying for any type of diesel or gas to power equipment? Incredibly granular. But then you take those categories, we put it into a model, and it's just really basic algebra. It spits out what that price per pound is needed at the farm gate to close the living income gap. And then you apply the FOB costs on top of it.
So that's, as you said, very granular and detailed. So question for both Monica and Grayson. Is that level of detail, did it require a kind of cultural shift within your organizations? Do they understand it? And how do you communicate it to consumers? Or do you need to communicate it to consumers? Or are consumers satisfied with a kind of a branding of verifiable living income? How do we, because we're trying to change the system here, right? To approach the pricing of what they pay for their coffee, be it a cup or a bag at the supermarket, that actually captures everything that Corey has just said. So let's start with Grayson. Yeah.
Yeah. So with our customers, we were very transparent in communicating why there was an increase in price from our 2020 lots to our 2021 lots of the same coffee from the same producer group. And it was kind of a choose your own adventure. If you want to get really granular into the details, here's a 25-page white paper where you could read about the full methodology. Otherwise, here's a 4-pager that's pretty more approachable to read about the kind of like key top level findings of what we did. And then for us, it was, we're a B2B business. So it was also important for us to create collateral for our customers to use to talk to their customers or the end consumers about verified living income and what that means. Because this is a new pricing methodology. And so there's not a certification symbol on the bag of coffee that you're purchasing, but it really is rooted in farmers' livelihood needs. And so we wanted to make sure that at least the people in the supply chain who we touch or work with were aware of what all of this means.
So Grace, in terms of the actual increase in pricing, potentially increasing pricing to your customers, what's the range? Is it 5 cents a cup? Is it $2 a bag? What's the range of increases that resulted from a commitment to verifiable living income?
So it was a 20% increase per pound of roasted coffee or green coffee that we sell in our marketplace to our customers.
20%. Okay.
20%.
So that would be a range of what in terms of dollar terms?
It was about 30 cents, I believe.
How much?
30 cents.
30 cents. So that's not enormous, is it?
It's not enormous. And we haven't had any pushback from our customers. In fact, this is one of the most popular coffees that we sell in our marketplace because people can feel really good about buying it.
Oh, Monica, do you have the same experience?
Yeah, I think amongst the high-end specialty line of customers, people who have a coffee shop or maybe a network of coffee shops in a given geographic region, they're selling wholesale coffee, they have e-commerce online. This really represents an innovation in how they're able to communicate their impact to their customers that helps them differentiate themselves, not only in a really crowded coffee space, but also a really crowded sustainability space where it's like, okay, what does it all mean if everything's ethical or natural? And this gives a toolkit to help people understand exactly what this impact attacks or is trying to solve for. So I think in this segment of roasters where they're really tied into a local community and they're selling to other small local businesses, this type of program carries a lot of meaning and there's a lot of room for expansion there.
So, we at Heifer are always concerned. There's 12.5, the numbers sort of estimate between 12 and 18 million smallholder farmers, right? I mean, so let's take the lower number, 12.5 million smallholder farmers. And to really have an impact on coffee lands, we need to have, maybe 1 million farmers under living income kind of protocols or more, if possible. What do you think? So this question is, how do we get that done? How does Heifer help? How do your two co-organizations, how do we get that going in a way that makes it really happen? I mean, I think the current migration or immigration problems that we have in the southern border in the United States is driven in part by this enduring low coffee pricing, which has just driven a lot of farmers to give up farming because it's simply not profitable or sufficient income to be able to feed and house their families. So what's your sense about how to, I'm sure you've talked about it at length and internally, how do you make this a big deal, right?
Yeah, so I can share my perspective on it or a few
Sure.
thoughts that I have, but I'd love to hear what Grayson or Corey have to say as well. I think on the one hand, we can't be daunted by the scope of the issue to the point that we're not taking any action at all. We can't look at the problem and say, it's so big, what's the point of doing anything? And I think that's what this pilot represents is we're going to try this. We're going to do it with one roaster who's going to make a commitment across their supply chain. And while it's not 12 million farmers, it's 1,000 farmers, and that's meaningful, right?
Yeah.
And if Bellwether can be that example for, the 200 other small and medium-sized coffee roasters that Sustainable Harvest partners with each year, that impact starts to magnify. And while it's not touching everyone, it's meaningful for the communities and the co-ops that we're working with on that scale, right? And then I think it's our job as an industry, as NGOs, as importers, as everyone involved, to think, how do we scale this to larger companies or to a larger framework so that it's accessible and the impact is magnified across the supply chain. And I think there's power in the way that we approach this with ASOPEP, the producer organization, and them being a permanent seat at the table as we have these conversations, because now they have data on what price they need, what price their producers need. And that's bargaining power for them when they're approaching contracts with potential new buyers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Grayson, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely echo everything Monica said. So, we as Bellwether, we're committed to expanding verified living income across our supply chains. As a company, we've committed to carrying this out across all of our Latin America supply chains by the end of 2023. But we're a small roaster manufacturer, and to really move the needle on this work, we need other roasters and coffee buyers to adopt the same methodology. But I think one of the most powerful things is really balancing the power differential between buyers and coffee producers. When we were analyzing the data and speaking to Camilo, who's the co-op manager of ASOPEP, and we were like, we want to pay more than we paid last year. And he was like, this is the first time that anybody's asked to pay more. And he felt, empowered to, as Monica mentioned, use the data that he has now at his fingertips to bargain with other coffee buyers as well. And so I think that the more we can keep producers in this conversation, then Bellwether's not the only company who's buying coffee from ASOPEP. And so it can have this rippling effect across cooperatives in not only who are purchasing coffee from them, but in Tolima as a region, in Colombia as a country, across Central America and Latin America. But definitely we need more people to be involved to really move the needle forward.
Now, you've raised an interesting point about data in terms of its empowering effect. I hadn't really heard that before, that because the producers or the co-op understand what they really need, as opposed to what they've just been told they're going to get paid for. How difficult is it? And we'll turn to Corey for that, because she's done a lot of work, I know, in terms of estimating the cost. But I'd like to hear from both Monica and Grayson as well. How have you gotten the data necessary to get to verified living income? What is the right price? Is it $2.40 a pound? Is it $3.50 a pound? What is the number? And how expensive is it to actually get those data? So it's interesting because Corey, let me turn it to you first of all, and then we'll go back to Grayson and Monica.
Sure, yeah. So I think this question also connects back to the question you asked about, does that level of granularity in the methodology create a cultural shift within companies and organizations? So I think what it really more powerfully creates a cultural shift in is for producers and cooperatives in terms of the granularity and the regularity in which they're tracking their own expenses. For a really long time, I think most co-ops and farming families have been told, oh, your labor doesn't count towards cost of production. Your internalized costs don't count for cost of production. And having someone really be willing to embrace the fact that these families absorb a huge amount of costs that subsidize the low market prices, and that folks are willing to recognize that, embrace that, and compensate them for that is really powerful. But I do not want to diminish how much work it is on the cooperative and farm level end to collect all of that data. I can say personally, if someone told me without my credit card company tracking it for me to write down every cent I spent over the cost of a year, my brain would explode. And that part of that is what we're asking farmers and cooperatives to do. But the traceability component is really, really important. And if I can just give one plug for traceability here, is that traceability and transparency should always go two ways. That's the definition of transparency, right? It's not a one-way mirror. And a lot of times transparency is really used to pull data out of origin and sends it along the supply chain without funneling it back up to the producers, who can be really empowered by that and use it not only for bargaining capacity, but for their own long-term management. And then I just went way off base with the question you asked. So One of the challenging things with what is the price for verified living income is that there is no the price, just like there's no one living income benchmark. It's very, very contextual. We did internally, as you know, at Heifer, a very, very macro verified living income exercise across 5 countries in Latin America. And we did that a lot with secondary data. And what we found was that for the average smallholder producer to earn a living income based on current production conditions, it would be around $2.50 at the farm gate, which would translate to roughly $3.30 FOB. For a cup of coffee that you're buying wherever you're buying coffee from, it's less than a quarter a cup. But that was taking data at a very, very, very large scale. For ASOPEP in particular, and Monica and Grayson can definitely talk to this because they have a very, very long history with ASOPEP. It's a different type of producer. Some of them have larger plots of land. They have a ton of access to trainings and inputs. So it was less for that particular group of farmers, but it's going to shift depending on who we're working with. And that's the point, because my needs in Washington, D.C. are going to look different than someone's needs in Arkansas or Nebraska. And so there's not one kind of flatline price.
All right, so let me turn to Monica and Grayson now in terms of the sort of the cost impact on your organizations on how to get the data. Because I'm really kind of intrigued by this idea that once you've got the data now, data is power, right? Information is power. So how much does it cost to actually do this? Have you found sense?
Yeah. So I don't have a figure. I think it would probably scare me if I quantified it, but I know that Corey, Grayson, and myself spent the better part of a year working on this. And that was something that all of our organizations committed to as a priority, but we also relied heavily on the co-op and from other thought leaders in the space, like our friends at Sustainable Food Lab, who really volunteered their time and intellectual property to help us think through this process so that the pilot that we ended up with was something meaningful. So for me, while I think the power of this pilot lies in the data and in the cost of production information that was collected and the living income benchmarks that were used, I think that's also the biggest weakness we have going forward, because there's no standardized or open source approach to collecting cost of production data. And we're still in the process of developing living income benchmarks globally. And I think that's where this multi-sectors and stakeholder engagement comes into play. How does the coffee industry come together to develop these tools? Because we can do them in silos, but it's somewhat inefficient. And it really, data collection does need to be embedded in how producer organizations are doing day-to-day business if they're committed to incorporating living income-based pricing. At least that's the best way we found now. That's not to say that it couldn't be simplified or made more mainstream, streamlined going forward. But right now, I think it's really searching for that cost of production data, and developing the living income benchmarks is what lies ahead.
So are we heading towards another certification system? God forbid.
I don't know, because it's a good question, but with certification comes its own set of rules and pricing and guidelines and enforcement. And it's hard to say if that's what we really need, is another label to put on a bag that has an administrative burden. I don't know. I think I'll end there and maybe see what.
Yeah. No, but I think you've talked about a process that's really important in terms of having a systematic, believable system that says verifiable living income is calculated using a protocol that everybody else is using, or close to what everybody else is using. What do you think about that, Grayson?
Yeah, I mean, I think really key to this pilot was collaboration across every node of the supply chain, from the cooperative to CLAC, who was working directly with the cooperative to collect data from 38 producers, to Heifer with y'all's living income expertise, to Sustainable Harvest connections at the ground level, to Bellwether's commitment to actually pay the price that we found and make sure that this didn't just live as desk research. So I think what's exciting about this, and what's exciting about thinking about an open sourced data set, is that maybe it doesn't become a certification if everyone is open sourcing the data together and agrees on a methodology, and we have living income benchmarks and we have cost of production by origin.
Yeah, and maybe to build on that, Grace, and I think in the way we think of certification now, let's use organic for an example. That's the roaster and the producer have their own standards that they need to fulfill, and they're being checked at every level. But I think perhaps with verified living income, the answer lies in it's not another burden that's placed on the producer organization, another certification that they have to pay for that maybe they don't capture the market value of, but perhaps it's more of a cost sharing model or something that the roaster engages in to have, an audit of their supply chain, or a consulting type relationship where they're told, like, here's how to implement verified living income in your supply chain based on the data we have available.
Corey, go ahead.
Sorry,
I know
go ahead.
you were jumping in. Yeah.
Saying I agree, certifications are cumbersome and intensive, and there are a lot of them out there. I would definitely love to see some universal definition of terms like fair prices, sustainably sourced, ethically sourced, et cetera, that does have this kind of data-driven economic context behind it. And it might be worth thinking about, what if this was not a roaster downstream owned industry certification, but a producer owned and managed verification, where there's just complete autonomy to collect the data, show that they have the data, calculate prices, and then confirm or deny if someone paid them that. I don't know how that would work. I don't know if that's less cumbersome and burdensome, but it might. I don't know of many verification systems that are actually put in the hands of farmers who are receiving the prices and doing the work themselves.
Now, I was thinking about the sort of pricing verification system that was used by the tomato farmers in Florida. Remember that? What's the Okalafaloki? I forget exactly. Yeah. And they basically had a farm worker certifying system, right? That actually defined or just guaranteed that they were going to get 2 cents a pound or whatever, or 2 cents a bucket, or whatever it is that they were being paid. Is there something like that where the coffee farmers themselves through the co-ops would say, all right, you just need to know, Mr. Buyer, that our verifiable living income price is $2.50. Now, you may not want to pay $2.50, but just know that that's the price that allows our members to live a dignified life. I mean, maybe the responsibility should be on the co-ops and the farmers themselves. Just because they know, I mean, they live there, they know what their costs, well, they don't know what their costs are. They should know what their costs are. Has that been tried? I know there's an organization that's working on this, right, Corey?
From what I understand, that certification system you're talking about with Imalaki has expanded in scale to other products. I don't know about nationally. I know there's a very small, very awesome store in DC, in Mount Pleasant, for anyone that lives in DC, that has adopted this with all of their produce sourcing, and it's incredible. Without having gone through the experience of building a certification and managing it myself, I think it would be incredible to have something like this be farmer owned, farmer driven, and instead of a company or third party entity giving up farmers a seal, the farmers could then say, okay, great, you paid this price. We'll share the data for how we got to that price with you. And here's a seal you can slap on your label that we said you paid a verified living income price. And theoretically, I think that's awesome.
Theoretically.
Logistically, I personally have no idea, and I don't want to pretend that I do, but Heifer is willing to support it, I can jump into it tomorrow.
Yeah. So why don't you bring up? We have some experience in conversations with a coffee company, a roaster, retailer, brand owner called Pachamama. Maybe you could just. I mean, I don't know, Monica and Grayson, if you're familiar with that company. You are. They're both nodding. Okay. So maybe for our listeners, you could briefly describe, Gary, or one of you describe, how does Pachamama succeed in selling its coffee at a premium price that actually exceeds the verified living income price. Anybody want to take that on?
I am familiar with them from a distance, but I couldn't speak to the intricacies of their model, unfortunately. But I know we shared some space with them around RICO when they won a sustainability award and we were first presenting verified living income. So I know we're in good company with them, but maybe the next step is putting together a conversation with them.
Yeah.
I can speak a bit about them. Grayson, I don't know if you have any experience with Pachamama. I don't want to jump in prematurely.
Not directly. So go ahead, Corey.
So they're a wonderful roaster and small chain of coffee shops based. Their downstream production is based in Northern California. And while I don't know all the ins and outs of their business, what's really powerful to me about their model is this is a farmer-owned roaster. So they roast in the United States. Their board is completely made up of cooperative representatives. And Thalion is the president, but not the owner of the company. The cooperatives and the farmers are the owner of the company. So very similar to what we were just talking about. It really shifts that power dynamic and says, hey, roaster, you work for us. We have the product. We have a lot of the knowledge. We can make our own financial decisions. They set their own prices, and then they also receive profit sharing at the end of the financial year. So it's an incredibly inclusive model that is driven and managed by producers. And as a result, their value capture is much higher.
And what was the claim in terms of what they were paying the farmers at the farm gate?
Oh,
Or at the co-op level? At the co-op level, I guess, yeah.
They put out a transparency report a few months ago. I don't remember the exact amount. It was well over $2 a pound. And that does not include the profit sharing at the end of the year. So that was just the contract price for coffee. And then essentially, just like a shareholder, all of those co-ops get dividends at the end of the year as well. But for coffee alone, Thalion, if you're listening and you want to throw this in the comments, it was something closer to the $3 mark, I believe.
Yeah, I remember the conversation I had with Thalion, and it was actually over $3, $3.24 or something like that, at the co-op level, not necessarily the farm gate. Anyway, that's one model.
I have a plug for Bellwether as well.
Yeah, go ahead. Shoot.
So in addition to pursuing the verified living income based pricing model and making a commitment to implementing this across their supply chain, Bellwether takes a really active role in engaging with co-ops in a way where they're saying, what do you need? What are your priorities? And in addition to paying this baseline price, they also have a program where they're giving a lump sum of money to the co-op to use at their discretion. In partnership with Bellwether, there's a conversation, there's updates that take place, but it's not Bellwether giving a mandate that says, you have to build drying beds. But if you want to build drying beds, that's great. And if that's how you want to use the money, here's the fund for this year. Thank you for your partnership. Thanks for your commitment to quality and to Bellwether. And I think that's a really powerful model as well, where they're looking at pricing and value add to facilitate the co-op's infrastructure or projects, whatever it is in a given year. And for one of the co-ops, it happened to be emergency COVID relief, where they had the money destined for one location, and then COVID happened. They pulled it and quickly shifted to provide immediate relief to members. So I think that's a great model as well.
It's a very great model, and it's very similar to what we do at Heifer, of course, in terms of working and actually listening to the communities, because they know better what they need and what they'd like to do. So we applaud your approach. So I'm still so it's not struggling exactly, but for example, I'm thinking about scale again. How do we make sure that we have scale? Because an awful lot of efforts in the coffee industry, as you well know, tends to be, well, the major roasters don't, in my opinion, don't really care about the farmers very much. They care because they need the supply, but that's about all their need is. So, the counter to me, and my background is a marketing background, so consumer marketing background. So I have that instinct of how do you get to consumers to actually start saying when they buy coffee, whether it be at, wherever it is, a Starbucks or anything else, will they ask the questions, well, how much the farmer gets, and do you think there's a possibility of aggregating a large number of smaller roasters who are interested in social justice, interested in dignity for the supplier, for the downhill, and engaging them in some way to advertise and promote the idea of living income? Would you, the two of you, participate in something like that? In terms of, especially if we can aggregate enough to have, a $10 million budget or $20 million budget to actually promote the idea of verified living income. I'm just laying it out there, just consumer-driven change, right? They don't want to commit.
I can jump in. Yeah, I think something like that would be very powerful. I think consumers, they do care, but it's a complicated issue, right? And we have to relate it to their lives and why it matters to them. I think a lot of people, there's so many commodities, there's so many agricultural products that we're so disconnected from as consumers. And when you go to the grocery store, it's overwhelming. You're picking up what's available, but you don't know the entire supply chain behind it. And it depends so much on your context, your economic ability to even care to invest in sustainable products. Organic, fair trade, bananas, these things are more expensive, and it's no different for coffee. So at some juncture, it's a privilege to have the choice to purchase sustainably, unfortunately, because so much of our supply chains are subsidized by poverty on the producing end and by climate externalities. And that's, a systems-wide change that needs to take place. I would love for coffee to be a beacon of light in how we do that. And I think it could start with a movement like you're talking about of here's a number of roasters who have power in collective volume together, not necessarily as individuals. And here's our commitment to moving living income forward in our supply chains.
I think the other end of that is I think that as a coffee industry, we've really done a disservice to consumers. Like we've been marketing that they're paying the prices that should be paid, that they're, fairly supporting coffee producers. And so I think something to really drive this initiative forward is we actually need to take a few steps back and lay out the problem again and how other pricing methodologies haven't solved the problem. And that's like why we're still here. It's why coffee farmers are still not being paid a fair price, and really educate consumers so that they can be more conscious consumers and really drive roasters to make better buying choices as well.
But both you, Grace, and Monica have been kind of encouraging to say that when you actually go to customers, whether it be B2B or B2C, there's an interest in this. There's actually an interest to do it right, and that's very encouraging. That's as a marketer, again, when you hear that yes, there is a response, a positive response to the message, then I think you can start piling on. And maybe that's a role that we at Heifer could play in terms of being a convener on something like that. So that's fascinating. As you know, I'm really, as you know, at Heifer, we're really passionate about this. We've been working in coffee land for years and with very little progress. In fact, we've stopped, I don't know if you know this, but we've stopped being what we call complicit with the coffee industry's practice of doing some small projects all over the lot, which really don't have any kind of cumulative impact or changes in people's lives. So we're looking for an approach that can have a substantial impact, and Corey is leading that for us. But let's turn it over to, I think we've gotten to the point where we're opening to questions, and we have, I think, a question in the question box. Okay. So a question from Nicholas Millan. It's about transparency as a must-have. We have to make it available for all, not just specialty coffee. So that's an interesting question about, have we been talking about specialty coffee only, or we've been talking about all coffees?
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think co-ops don't just produce specialty coffee. Even specialty co-ops sell coffee at different quality grades. And that's something that we don't want to discourage that and say it's only specialty coffee is the only way. If there's a model that applies to different segments and different quality levels, or at least acknowledges the sale of those and that they have a different price in the market, and there's this balanced approach to looking at tiers of coffee, I think that makes a lot of sense, because we always say there's a home for every coffee, and that's true, but that doesn't mean that commercial coffee or coffee that's not 85 points doesn't get to be sustainable, doesn't get to be living income. I think there's a way to approach that, because in some ways, producing lower grade coffees, there's less selection, there's less manual labor perhaps. So the cost of producing it, we could discover that is lower, and there could be a price associated with that.
Mm-hmm. And I think go ahead, Grayson.
I was just going to say, one thing that we failed to mention is that the verified living income price is the price floor. Yep. And so there should be quality differentials on top of that as well.
Yeah. Corey, in terms of the mass of coffee, right? Maybe not necessarily Robusta coffee, for example. Has any work been done in terms of living income calculations? Do you know?
I believe there has been through, and I'm thinking specifically of True Price. It's not necessarily living income based. There's not a lot of living income based pricing mechanisms out there, but a kind of group of organizations called True Cost has looked at Robusta coffee, I think specifically in Vietnam and maybe Indonesia, in terms of its economic cost, its social cost, and its environmental cost. Mm-hmm. But having the living income component to it is huge, and it's really necessary. And I agree with Nicholas that transparency should be mandatory, regardless of how super high quality or kind of mass market commercial the product is. Transparency shouldn't be reserved for, we're very proud to have this story and this price, and therefore we're going to be transparent about it. That's not how consumer education happens. It's not how change happens. It should be, this is the information for everything, and then consumers can make their own decisions based on that.
So we have an anonymous question. Is there any contractual mechanism that allows roasters to have the security of the price that producers receive on their farms, farm gate price to contracts?
Yeah, that's a great one. And I think, or sorry to jump in first, I don't know if anyone wants to to say anything, but I think that's a tricky guarantee to put in place, or mechanism to put into place. The way we dealt with it in this pilot was by having a relationship of trust and transparency with the co-op that spanned several years. So there was, that trust built between us. I think the way that co-ops buy coffee isn't that they get a contract from Bellwether or from Sustainable Harvest, and then they go out and buy coffee one day, and then a day later, their whole container is ready to ship. Co-ops are buying throughout the season. And whether we like it or not, the local price is anchored to the market price. And so co-ops can have a price that they're offering to their members, but it's a day or a week price. And if they're paying one price based on a market that's at 80 cents, but they know that they're paying a verified living income of $2.24, so they're able to offer their co-op members a higher price. But then what if the market shoots up to 250, right? They have to pay 250 to even capture the coffee for their producers. And it's this long cycle for co-ops where they're doing this dance of purchasing from their members and making sure that's matching with the contracts that they're getting with roasters or importers.
Right. You know, in conversation we had with Pachamama on their pricing, because they were not, the 5 cooperatives that actually own Pachamama don't sell 100% of their coffee through Pachamama. It's just too big. I think they sell something like 18 to 20% of their coffee through Pachamama. Interestingly, he said the economics for the farmers is that 20% at a much higher price is, you know, it's basically revenue enhancements, like an airline, right? Like if I can sell 20% of my seats at a very high price, I make money. And so they were using it in the same way. They were actually recognizing the revenue from the 20% they were selling at much higher prices and then sharing it across all the farmers. They were approaching it that way, as opposed to just having a few farmers benefit from the higher price. But that takes some, you know, that takes some organization and administration. But that seemed very fair to me, that you know, there's this sort of solidarity behind the pricing and the sharing of the increased revenue. So, interesting thing. So there was another question which actually related to part of the conversation we had, and this is from, hang on, this is from Hugo Rodriguez Iteres. What are the incentives for the private sector to accept a VLI price? How do we sell this methodology is his question. So we talked a little bit about that, but it's worth reprising, because I think at the core of what we're trying to do is there ultimate demand, sufficient demand to change this system in a way that's, you know, that's really beneficial for the farmers. So you've got experience, Grayson and Monica, so I want to hear what your experience is.
I can jump in here. So I think that, you know, kind of regardless of the supply and demand for paying fair prices, as you mentioned earlier, Pierre, where people are leaving coffee farming altogether because prices are so low, paying living income-based pricing is relevant to the stability of the coffee industry. We're seeing, you know, climate change affecting the land that's viable for coffee farming, people leaving coffee farming altogether. And so as an industry and as the private sector, we have to pay these fair prices for our industry to continue to exist.
Interesting point. Yeah, it's the sustainability of the industry, never mind the individual farmers. Right. And that resonates with people?
I think it's definitely, you know, back to that education component, where if you've never visited a coffee farm before, you might not know that coffee grows on trees. So it's really like presenting to the industry and to consumers who drink coffee every day the challenges that we face as an industry.
Yeah, no, you know, I remember the trip I once made to Guatemala. I was up in the Huehuetenango area in the northwestern part, and we visited this farm. It's a large farm. It was a 5-hectare coffee farm, and there were 2 sons there. They were strapping young men. They were big guys with long machetes hanging off their belt. And they were planning to leave for the United States. They said, we can't make money growing coffee, even that size farm. And that farm was going to go fallow. I mean, they weren't going to produce coffee anymore. And I just said, wow, even a large farm like this, I mean, the price was so low, just couldn't make any money. And they knew it. They knew they wouldn't make any money. And I think that's the phenomenon you're talking about, right, Grayson? Yeah. And slowly but surely at the edges, this erosion ultimately leads to, I mean, it's part of the contributing factor to the fact that pricing right now is higher than it has been for a while, right? I mean, you've got the weather issues in Brazil and obviously COVID and then just a steady erosion of supply simply because people are just not making any money. So there's a couple more questions. Hold on one second. Okay, so let me just read the question from Andrew Harrison. realizing that the goal of increasing premiums to coffee producers isn't solely isolated to case studies, trainings, and education opportunities at farm import retail. What are some of the technological innovation platforms you find to be promising? Okay. Is there something beyond price? I think that is the question here.
Yeah, I might not give a super satisfying answer, but my immediate take on this is, I think your point that you're getting to with the technological innovations, I think that's where there's a lot of potential. I don't know of one that exists now that solves our problems, but when we talk about open source information on living income benchmarks or calculating cost of production, if that was something that could be done easily in a mobile way, where there's not this burden of writing things down pen on paper, transferring them to Excel, doing the calculations manually, if there's a tool available for roasters to calculate what their living income price should be based on the cost of production and associated benchmarks with their cooperative, I think technology definitely plays a role there. And I think there's space for innovation. I think the problem is what does that cost? Who develops it? Who owns it? And who pays the cost?
If I can add to that, I think in a lot of ways, especially if we're talking about technologies that relate to pricing, it's not what technology is or isn't available. It's how are those technologies currently being used. I think blockchain's a really great example of that. Blockchain has the capacity to provide full transparency, both back up the supply chain to the farm level and co-op level and all the way through to consumers. And a lot of times what it ends up doing is really editing data, editing a narrative, and kind of painting a very specific picture of what is being shared, both up and downstream, and calling that traceability. So not to sound like a movie, we have the technology, it's who owns it, who's benefiting from it, and how is it being used and positioned to the broader public.
Yeah, and I think not directly related to living income, but definitely supporting the same end goal of sustainability in the supply chain and for producers. Companies, especially large companies, their sustainability reporting standards are growing every day, and the list is getting more specific, and they're having to comply more and more, especially in markets or countries where government legislation is changing around sustainability reporting. And that's going to be downward pressure to producers who then need to start answering about carbon capture and their impact. And I think on the one hand, it could be a burden if all of a sudden we're just demanding more and more information from producers with nothing else, no price increase, nothing being kicked back to them. But on the other hand, having some sort of technology that tracks cost of production, that allows them to measure their carbon footprint, or sell carbon credits, whatever it is, if we can couple those things together, I think those become tools for producers and producer organizations to differentiate themselves and to be leaders in that sustainability space, providing an answer to these asks from customers.
Good. Well, I think we probably could talk for several hours more, but we've come to the end of our time here. Monica and Grayson, thank you so much for participating. Corey, of course, as well. But I also want to thank your organizations for being so committed to the welfare of others. It's both a business opportunity for you all, and you are successful at that, and you are concerned about the welfare of others, and that's admirable. And really thank you for that approach and that perspective and that worldview. So we thank you for that. So Monica, Grayson, Corey, thank you so much for the time you spent with us. And let's keep working at it. We'll slowly but surely we'll solve this problem and make several million people live life of dignity and less suffering at the very least. Okay. So thank you all.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Good to see you all.